Great. I'm Professor Green, and today we'll be talking about Chapter 16, Managing in a Diverse Workforce. So this topic should be quite familiar to many of you. Over the last few years, as we've seen Black Lives Matter and the Me Too movement, working in a diverse workforce is probably second nature to many of you. But we're going to go through a couple of major premises that you'll want to be aware of as you enter the workforce and how to make sure that you engage with a diverse workforce. The case study that we'll be working with today is the DACA case and how Apple got involved. So in 2019, President Trump came in and said that he would like to pull the work permits for these employees that had work permits by exception, let's say. That DACA, right, that stands for the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. So these are the people that arrived in the United States, mostly from Latin America as children. They grew up here, and now 20 years later, 15 years later, they are eligible to work. And there were 80,000 immigrants that came to the U.S. that are in this umbrella of DACA. And Apple hired the textbook said 250, and then the Financial Times article said 443 employees under this umbrella. So they hired these employees that didn't have citizenship, but they had work authorization because of this new DACA regulation. And when President Trump got into office, he said that these are truly not citizens, and they do not have a green card, that they shouldn't have work authorization. And so they told Apple and a lot of IT companies, that they needed to then let these employees go. And when Apple heard this, they said that they were not going to listen to the government, and they did not want to fire these employees because they just felt that they were so valuable to the organization. They did this metric as to, there'd be billions of dollars they said that they would lose because of the amazing productivity of these DACA employees. And Apple said that this is diversity, and that diversity is so helpful to their business. They said that magical things happen when a company has access to new perspectives, education, and life experiences. And so what is, again, the right thing to do here? Should we allow these people to work in the United States even though they traditionally don't have work authorization? Or should we pull their work permits and let them figure things out on their own? So let's go through the key learning objectives here in this chapter, and that'll help lead us into the major ideas for Chapter 16. The first key learning objective here is knowing in what ways the workforce in the United States is diverse and evaluating how it might change in the future. So this is identifying what is the present situation, how much diversity do we have, how much do we have to deal with, and what are we looking to for the future, and as managers, how should we be managing that? The objective number 2 is understanding where women and persons of color work, how much they are paid, and the roles that they play as managers and owners. So those are the two major groups of diverse employees, so women and persons of color. Objective number 3 will be identifying the role government plays in securing equal employment opportunities for historically disadvantaged groups, and debating whether or not affirmative action is an effective strategy for promoting equal opportunity, right? So we've talked a lot about this semester about regulations and how the government can get involved in monitoring business. And now we'll be talking about when it comes to diversity, and especially when it comes to one of the regulations that was passed decades ago called affirmative action, but you'll see that there's a lot of criticism for affirmative action as if it's actually being effective or not. Number 4 here is assessing the ways diversity confers a competitive advantage, as Apple was saying, that they feel that they have these new perspectives and that there's value in that. Number 5 is formulating how companies can best manage workforce diversity, making the workplace welcoming, fair, and accommodating to all employees, so going forward and encouraging diversity. And then the last learning objective is understanding what corporate policies and practices are most effective in helping today's employees manage the complex multiple demands of work and family obligations. So talking about parental leave and family leave. Let's go ahead and hop into the first slide here. This is the changing face of the workforce. So they define diversity here as the variation in the important human characteristics that distinguish people from one another. The primary dimensions are age, ethnicity, gender, mental or physical abilities, race, sexual orientation. So as you see, even age shows up here. That you want to make sure that you have diverse age groups. You don't want all millennials, or you don't want all, you know, white men with gray hairs, right? You want to have people of lots of different ages, lots of different ethnicities, genders, etc. The secondary dimension here are characteristics such as communication style, family status, and their first language. For this chapter, we focus mostly on those primary dimensions, not the secondary ones. When we talk about workforce diversity, this is diversity among employees of a business or an organization, and this represents both a challenge and an opportunity for businesses, right? As we've seen in recent years, it truly is an opportunity. The textbook chapter talked a lot about Ultimate Software, this company that really is a leader in diversity. So you can see that there are some companies that are really doing great on this topic, and they see it not only in their culture, but then also in their bottom line. They've been very, very productive. Let's talk about the changing force of the workforce. A second slide here. There'll be 3 slides about changing face of the workforce. Here it says that today the U.S. workforce is as diverse as it ever has been. We're going to talk about some diversity trends. Immigration has profoundly reshaped the workplace. So in 2017, 27 million immigrants were working in the United States, comprising almost of 17% of the workforce, right? That's a good amount of immigrants. Ethnic and racial diversity is increasing. So by 2022, which is around the corner in just a few months, the U.S. workforce is projected to be about 39% non-white. And this is for all of America. But if we were to look at statistics for just California, these statistics would be even higher. The workforce will continue to get older. So by 2024, the U.S. Bureau of Labor Statistics projects that 36 of 65 to 69-year-olds will continue to work. So this is because the cost of living is going up in this country, and we have a little bit of inflation, and the retirement packages are not as good anymore, so people have to work longer. Our parents or our grandparents, they were able to easily retire at 65, but nowadays most people have to work to 70, 75 at least, in order to have a nice retirement package. And the last bullet point here is that millennials are entering the workforce, and that in 2015, millennials became the largest generation in the U.S. workforce. So you guys are not millennials, but it's a good idea to understand who these millennials are, because they're all over the place, but they are your managers. And we're on page 351 of the textbook if you're following along. Now let's talk a little bit about the proportion of women and men in the labor force, because this is a really, I think, interesting graph. You'll see that the proportion of men in the last couple of decades is dropping, and the proportion of women is rising. Pretty natural to see the proportion of women rising, right? Because since the 1970s, that we've had this feminist movement, and women have gotten more educated, and there's just been a really strong push to include women in the workplace. And you'll see that in 1990, that the rate of women returning of being included in the workplace has actually slowed, because from the 50s to the 90s, there was a nice increase because of feminism and things. But then since the 1990s, women still have issues now returning to work after having children. And so we'll get into this further in this chapter, but you'll see that rate has slowed because there isn't as much support. More and more women want to get into the workplace, but there isn't a lot of support for women to return to the workplace. And so that's why that rate has kind of leveled out a little bit. So especially millennials, there's a trend with millennials to stay home after having children. But why is the rate of men in the workplace, why is that decreasing? Here, we're going to talk about that as well in the next couple of slides. Talks about illness, disability, incarceration, and that has affected more men than it has women. Let's hop into the next slides and talk more about this. So gender and race in the workplace, this is between 1950s and the late 2000s. As I just said, that the women it's increased, but it's remained between 46 and 40%, 47% since then. And men's participation rate declined between 1950 and 2016, and the proportion of adult men who worked fell from 70% to about 53%. So those are the exact numbers of that previous graph. So here it says that labor force rates for men and women are converging because, as I mentioned, illness, disability, and incarceration have negatively impacted men more than women. So somehow in the last 2 or 3 decades, more men have been getting sick and not being able to return to the workplace, becoming disabled. And also there's a trend where if you get out of prison, if you get out of incarceration, there's a really hard time actually returning to work and getting a steady job. They say there's not a lot of support for men who get out of prison and want to return to work. Also, the second bullet point here is about the increase in women's participation. It's been attributed to higher levels of education attainment. As I mentioned, delayed childbearing is another big one, why women can stay in the workplace longer because of IVF and different things. People can put off having a child for a decade or so. And then there's also a decreased tendency of women staying home to raise children. So less support, and also they say that millennials would like that more traditional family life as well. So the labor force rates for minorities have always been high. So as we've seen traditionally, that we'll talk also in this chapter about that minorities have statistically always been hard workers or in the workforce. So let's go ahead and talk more about the gender and racial pay gap. So women and persons of color on average receive lower pay than white men do. So here the gap has narrowed over the past quarter century because this has become such a big issue. So companies really make sure to look at and see if a man and a woman are at the same level in an organization. They should be being paid the same. But that the one group that tops white men in median weekly earnings is Asian American men, and they make about $1.17 for every dollar that a white man earns. And I thought that was really interesting. I never heard that statistic before, actually, but it makes sense because of education, that they say half of Asians in the United States hold a bachelor's degree or above. So they have more schooling than any other ethnic group in the United States. I thought that was super interesting. It actually says a lot for the Asian cultures and how much they value education and discipline and achieving one's goals. So let's talk about this next slide here, where we have this graph that shows the gender and race pay gap. So for cents on the dollar, these are just the minorities, so, and women being included, right? So women were getting 81 cents on the dollar, white women were getting 81 cents on the dollar, and Hispanic men were getting even less. They were getting 73 cents on the dollar, and then black men were getting just a little bit lower, 72 cents on the dollar for the same position. And black women were getting 69 cents on the dollar, and they say that Hispanic women were getting even less, 64 cents on the dollar. So I thought that was a pretty interesting graph to see how these minorities rate against each other. We'll do 2 more slides here on the gender and racial pay gap. So we'll talk a little bit about the possible reasons for this gender pay gap, right? So why are women getting less than men? And there's some discrimination against the sex, against women. Women's choices to pursue lower paying jobs or slower advancement. So they've decided to not advance as quickly because they want to potentially leave an opportunity open to taking care of children, and so they don't feel like they need to climb the corporate ladder because they have a second priority. And then also the third possible reason is occupational segregation. So this is all about inequitable concentration of a group in a certain job category. So I thought this was really interesting. This has some overlap with potentially your organizational behavior course, where we talk about what are the trends or the culture ideas within society or within an organization. So this is saying that certain races or certain genders segregate themselves into a certain type of job that is in the end lower paying. So this is saying that the Hispanics become agricultural workers or gardeners, and obviously that is a lower pay grade, right? That there's this trend that they will move into those types of jobs, and that white men will move into banking or academia, etc., which is a higher pay grade. And we also talk about here the pink collar ghetto. So these are sex type jobs. Again, super interesting and something that you might have spoken about in your organizational behavior course. This is where women have made great strides in entering professional occupations such as banking or manual labor jobs. But there's also these pink collar ghetto that still exist, where a lot of women, society has encouraged them to go and become preschool teachers, hairdressers, dental hygienists. They say in the book, like, the percentage of females in these areas is like almost like 99% female in those three types of jobs, and that their pay and their chances for upward mobility are limited in those types of jobs, and that society has created opportunities for women and people of color to move to jobs to move to these jobs where they won't necessarily make more money. I have to say that as a teenager, my dad was very encouraging of me to become an engineer. He didn't encourage me to move into this pink ghetto. He thought that I had the skills to move into a job that traditionally is held by white men, which is a job either in engineering, and then I went into banking. So I did it twice, getting into a job that could pay a whole lot more. Let's talk about the last slide here, the gender and racial pay gap. There's one area of the economy where racial and gender discrimination seems stubbornly persistent and is high, and that's in IT, in technology. So they have two examples here where at Yahoo, it's 61% white and 63% male, so that's quite high. And at Facebook, they're 43% white and 65% male. So I know that both of those companies are working hard to make changes in those statistics. We're on page 355 if you're following along. Before we go on to the next slide, you can't help but think about Marissa Mayer and Sheryl Sandberg, right? Those are two exceptions. That Yahoo was really proud of Marissa Mayer for becoming CEO and of Sheryl Sandberg as well, becoming a C-level executive at Facebook. So those are exceptions, but those are definitely not the norm. Let's talk about where women and persons of color do manage. So this says here that in 2018, around half of all managers and professionals were women. So there are women managers out there, right? Slightly more than 9 million women were working as managers by the mid-2010s, which is exciting. So as you can see, right, a lot of your parents, a lot of your mothers probably do work or potentially are managers. Women managers tend to be concentrated, though, in occupations where women are numerous at lower levels. So you'll see a lot of women managers in education and in healthcare, but not necessarily in banking or in engineering or these other industries or in IT, where men typically are managers at lower levels. Again, the book came up with an exception, and that is Rosalind Brewer. So she's an African-American female, and she became the COO of Starbucks a handful of years ago, and they were really proud to have brought her on board. Let's talk. The next slide also goes on to talking about women and persons of color and where they manage. This is talking about now persons of color. Again, they've said that Blacks have made progress in educational administration and human resources. So those are two industries where they're doing well. Hispanics have progressed in property and real estate, which is great. And Asians are somewhat overrepresented in the management ranks, particularly in the field of IT. So as we said, right, Asians are very well, in general, very well educated, and also those Asian cultures, they often encourage their sons to go and work in technology. So that makes a whole lot of sense. Let's look at this snapshot of diversity in these selected occupations. That what I thought was interesting when I looked at this graph was that we see that women are showing up here in medical and health services managers. They're also showing up in human resources managers, and they're also showing up as educational administrators, as the previous slides said. Right, as when we go through and look at the Blacks, it's pretty well distributed, right? There are not so many Blacks in marketing and as sales managers. That fits pretty well with my personal experience as well. I don't see them very often there. The Asians, pretty limited as educational administrators, right? But pretty high here in food service managers or computer and IT managers. And then the Hispanics, pretty streamlined here, but it says all occupations and, as I said, property, real estate, and community association managers. And the second highest here is our food service managers. So that's a pretty interesting graph to see where all of these different minority groups, where they place in different industries. So let's just identify what breaking the glass ceiling, what that means. It's, I think, a traditional term. We probably heard about this first in the 80s, I'd say, soon after the feminist movement in the 1970s. And this says that although women and minorities are as competent as white men in management, they rarely do attain these high positions in corporations. So the glass ceiling they talk about is this invisible barrier that exists in reaching these higher levels. And it's something that we think of in society, that women get to a certain, or minorities get to a certain point, but somehow they just can't get to that next level, and they can see it, but that's why it's glass, but they can't actually get there. And so recent advances show some cracking of the glass ceiling. And when I was in school in 2003, this was definitely a hot topic, and that they were saying that yes, women are really truly breaking through that glass ceiling, as we've seen with Marissa Mayer, Sheryl Sandberg, and the COO of Starbucks. Let's look at the women as a percentage of members of the board of directors in selected countries. So again, these are just selected countries. This isn't like a ranking of any sort. I thought it was super interesting that in Norway, that this have a really high percentage, which makes sense because in the Scandinavian countries, there's a lot of support for women in the workplace. They have amazing maternity and paternity leave. There's an excellent work-life balance. So it's really quite possible for women to return to the workplace. And so they can have leadership positions, and then they show up here as members of the board of directors. So they'd say almost over 40% of board of directors are women in Norway. France, the same thing. Also, France is very famous for having a minimum of 5 weeks of vacation per year. And so that really gives people an opportunity to balance their work and their home life. Sweden, as I said, is one of the other Scandinavian countries that really supports women in the workplace. Italy, I was surprised to see that so high, but that's great. New Zealand, etc. When we go down to the bottom, United Arab Emirates, right? Still a very male patriarch society, so that makes a lot of sense why they only have less than 3% of women on their boards. South Korea, also patriarchal society. Japan, Russia, Mexico. Kind of surprised to see Mexico because they can be very forward at times, but still ranking quite low. Here is the United States, decently low, right? 15% of members of boards in the United States right now have women. which I have to say is quite surprising because there's been such a huge push to bring women onto boards. And as we spoke about in this course already, the boards are so powerful and have just really great opportunities for leadership. Let's talk about the next slide, breaking the glass ceiling. What is this? Another key measure of diversity is representation on women on corporate boards. Women worldwide held 15% of directorships in 2016 with variations per nation, as we saw on the previous slide. In 2015, Germany required companies to give 30% of board seats to women, joining other European nations with similar rules. And, obviously in the EU, if you know anything about EU regulations, a lot of the other EU countries often follow what Germany is doing because they are the largest and one of the most powerful countries in the EU. And that, I think, is remarkable. Really interesting to see Germany taking such a lead on this. And the last bullet point here is that in the United States, in the UK, investors are pressuring companies to appoint women and minorities. Makes perfect sense. Let's talk again about breaking the glass ceiling. Some recent studies have shown that companies with a higher proportion of women on their boards were less likely to be involved in corruption and earn higher scores for management of carbon emissions and toxic releases. So, all right, bringing in this diversity, bringing in these different viewpoints, looking at different factors that go into running a business, sustainability, that's what this statistic is showing that women can bring. And another recent review of academic studies concluded that greater gender diversity on boards did not make much difference. So there are conflicting ideas as to whether women are truly making a difference on these boards. So the next slide says, would adding women to boards truly improve your performance? More diverse boards avoid to rush to consensus and realistically consider alternative courses of action. That's probably a good thing. Women bring different life experiences to the table and are more likely to raise multiple stakeholder concerns, right? Because this idea is that women are more empathetic and they often look at different people's point of views traditionally more than men. And the last bullet point here is from the Aspen Institute. The Aspen Institute is one of the most credible and well-respected research groups in the United States. It's huge, based in Colorado, and it is a nonprofit organization. And so they say here that they've argued that women simply lead differently, demonstrate traits such as I mentioned, empathy, collaboration, and skill at conflict resolution. So really interesting to understand, like, why do we want women on boards? And so what continues to hold women and minorities back as executives and directors? So we've had all this awareness and change in the workplace, like, why are they not there yet? The first bullet point says that many women and minorities start in staff rather than line positions. I thought this was really interesting. So if you think a little bit about what a staff position is, that's like a PR or a marketing role, but a line position, this is, as we saw with our guest speaker, with Zach, he talked about finance, operations, and law. So this is, in those positions, they say that's where you will acquire more skills, management skills, that are then more likely to lead to the executive suite. So once you have those skills, then you can more easily get promoted into management and director roles. But traditionally, women are more in those PR and marketing roles, where you don't get that experience. The second bullet point here says that the recruiters fill positions by word of mouth, often using this old boys network. So women get excluded. I've never had that experience personally, but I can foresee it happening where, there's a male recruiter and he recruits his friends, or he recruits the people that he knows, and he recruits for companies that are all men. And there's just this cycle of only including men, and that women are not necessarily included. The third bullet point here is that companies lack a commitment to diversity, and that I can see, that companies will say that they want to be diverse, but are they actually doing the work? And the fourth bullet point here is that there's too little accountability for equal employment opportunities at top level management levels. So again, that companies will say that they would like to include diversity, but they're not actually measuring that, and there's not accountability for actually including people there, including minorities there. And the last bullet point that is not on this slide, but I thought that was super interesting from the textbook, is that women have also chosen to step off the corporate ladder, as I mentioned, to look after children and parents as well. So they make that choice, and so that's a reason also why they're not breaking through that glass ceiling. So let's talk about women and minority business ownership now. So when women and minorities decide to not work for a bigger organization, but to own their own business, how does that work and how does that play into society? So this says here that some women and minorities have chosen to avoid the glass ceiling, right, by opening their own businesses, which is a great opportunity and great option. By the mid-2010s, 36% of over 28 million U.S. businesses were owned by women and 15% by minorities. So that's really great, giving them the power and confidence to do that. One huge success is the Chobani yogurt case. That company was opened up by Turkish immigrant Hamdi Ulukaya. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He is such an amazing story. He went to upstate New York and saw an old factory that used to be managed by Kraft Foods, and he saw potential in that factory and decided to open up a yogurt company, because when he was working in Turkey, his family owned a dairy company, and it has just become hugely successful, and he's gone forward, and with his success he's shared that amongst his employees, and he actually goes forward and tries to hire a lot of immigrants, because he just believes in the power of empowering them to make a life here in the United States for themselves. The third bullet point here on this slide is that in 2015 there were almost 1 million minority-owned businesses in the United States, which is great, and more than 50% of these firms were owned by Asians, Hispanics, by Asians, obviously, right, because we can see that the Asians are typically well-educated and driven. The Hispanics owned 32%, and African Americans owned about 11%. So those are, I think, some really nice statistics, and you can see that there is a lot of growth when it comes to having minorities taking on leadership positions in the United States. Good, so that ends part 1 of this chapter. I look forward to joining you for part 2.